we need access to all of those things in order to be able to communicate it with other.
Sarah here is talking about one theory about why we have consciousness. What do we need it for? It's worth watching her video in full, but I will summarize it by saying that she is talking about psychological research and some hypotheses that suggest that pretty much everything that we do in everyday life, including reasoning and making decisions and so on, can be done unconsciously. And the only real reason why we might need conscious access is in order to communicate it to other people. One thing I think a lot of people don't really realize is that the way that we tend to think of consciousness and the history of how that evolved is really from just one civilizational, history, which is Western civilization. But this idea that most of what we do is unconscious, which Sarah here is describing as kind of a recent discovery based on psychological research, that's something that has been known for a very long time in the East. Eastern philosophy followed a path of introspective awareness. So they put a lot of emphasis on contemplation and introspection rather than on sort of a focus in the West, which was mostly about looking at the external world first and looking at things from the outside. There's a notion of kind of objective exploration and not really a lot of emphasis on what's happening when we're actually thinking or feeling or perceiving or what's going on with consciousness. The topic of what is consciousness was a central aspect of the introspective investigations going on in the East. I personally spent a lot of time investigating things in this direction, following mostly Buddhist, but also Taoist and some other traditional approaches. As you follow that path, this is not just a theoretical understanding, but it's also kind of a direct understanding that you acquire as you pursue this. It becomes very, very evident that almost everything that we do is done unconsciously. So there's really no surprise there for people who are from that tradition. It's very, very obvious when you really look into it. So the hypothesis Sarah is talking about is that we evolve consciousness only because we need it to communicate. We need it to share our experiences with others. Eastern philosophy would basically agree in some respects with this point of view, which is that the introduction of language does create elaborately, vastly more complex structures that are based in constructions of, explicit maps, and they can be like temporal and spatial maps, notions of history, time, and so on, which are explicitly thought through by entities that use language. And these stories that you can create with language become much, much more elaborate and in-depth when you're dealing with human beings or other sentient beings that are trying to communicate. But I think it's incorrect to say that everything that we do when it comes to consciousness is simply a matter of a need to communicate. So one way to think about consciousness is that they are self-referential models. They're models that we have of our own functioning. So we can say like, I am thinking this, I am feeling this, I thought this yesterday, I have this plan to do X, Y, Z, and so on. In order to do this, we have to create abstractions. We have to actually map what our own functioning into some kind of representation, even if it's in our minds, that we can then further process. In essence, it's kind of like a meta description of ourselves. Now, I'm going to make an argument that this is something that creatures, as they get more sophisticated, more complex, will start to need to do, even if they don't do it as elaborately as creatures like us that use language to communicate. If you look at systems like ChatGPT, I actually think there's something interesting to learn about this problem, because one of the problems ChatGPT has, or any of these large language models, is that they tend to make mistakes which can be corrected if they introspect on the output that they're generating. What I mean by that is, for example, if you look at the way these systems work, they're just generating tokens in a sequence. So the only context they actually have as they're generating things one after another, like token, which gets turned into language, is the context of the previous things that they've just said and the things that came before it. So basically, they do this computation over the sequence of tokens that came before, and then they output another token and so on. So it's just kind of a stream like this. But errors can happen. So let's say you are generating the stream and then you make a mistake somewhere in there and then you keep going. You're just going to keep going based on that stream, the mistakes. You put those mistakes in there and they just keep going and going and going. One of the error correcting techniques is to have the system look over what it just output and say, what are the reasoning steps you use to get to this conclusion? And then it'll write those out. And then you can ask it, tell me what you think of these reasoning steps. And it will say, the first step is valid, the second step is invalid, the third step is valid, the fourth step is invalid, right? And then you say, now reconsider what you just said. And it says, I now realize that, I was incorrect to assume X, Y, Z, like these other things. And so in a sense, you're kind of creating this feedback loop where it's examining what it did. It tries to infer what, reasoning it used, and then it recognizes the error and corrects it. And this type of additional layer of introspective processing can greatly improve the accuracy of these systems. I believe that most sentient beings at the complexity, let's say a cat or a dog, have some level of this. That's not very sophisticated compared to humans, but they're doing something like this as an error correction technique. In other words, they must be, I think, after you get to a certain level, it becomes evolutionarily advantageous to develop a system of introspection, of thinking about what you are doing, quote unquote, and making some self-corrections that way. It just improves the effectiveness of the system. The fact that they don't have language, though, actually makes it difficult to even remember what you were thinking before and reference it again. So they must have most animals, I would say, must have a much more limited array of self-awareness, quote unquote, than human beings do, because we can generate much more elaborate things. We can write things down. We can refer to things that we've written down and so on. And then we can also use this to communicate with other people. One of the other problems that Eastern philosophy focuses in on are what are the kind of negative effects of language. So a lot of, let's say, Buddhism is about trying to undo some of the damage that is caused by our language capabilities, our tendency to become much more neurotic, our tendencies to elaborate these stories which aren't necessarily actually accurate. We forget that the story is not an accurate representation of our actual internal process, nor is it an accurate representation of the external world. And a lot of Buddhism in particular and other Eastern traditions are around getting people to see this and to realize that the very language that we're using to communicate and maybe to self-correct is also inaccurate. And if you don't realize that, you're going to then the system itself creates its own set of pathological problems. You can have neurosis, you can have all sorts of not living in reality, not accepting new information because it goes against the stories that you're telling yourself. So I would say the Easterners would agree that language creates a whole new level of both powerful tools and incredible problems that we need to address.